Hello everyone, Prime here. We've had a great day because today we're going to be going over Thor, Indra, and Zeus and determining who exactly would be the better god to worship and believe in and have within that sphere of life. We're going to be comparing their strengths, how many worshippers they would probably tend to get, and extra little details that you would want to know if you're giving tributes and sacrifices and prayers and all of this time to beings. So, first and foremost, we have strength, and Thor is usually the god to call when you need a giant taking down or some threatening beast is knocking at the door. He was the go-to warrior god of the pantheon after all, and he was even tricked into wrestling old age itself at one point, so he is incredibly strong. Indra, on the other hand, has 4 arms, and one of them carries a thunderbolt, another carries arrows, another a bow, another a hook, and another a net. Now, there are some variations on the things that these arms carry, and there are some variations in which Indra himself doesn't even have 4 arms, but assuming that he does, then, there you go. He also had an elephant with multiple trunks, and a 7-headed horse which was invincible in battle. His lightning bolts were strong enough to split mountain. On the other side of the fence here, Zeus commands a lot of respect from the muses to the other gods, and his lightning bolts tend to keep things in order when the threat of him acting isn't enough to do so. Now, none of these gods are actually immune to being disabled in some sort of fair fight. Thor can lose limbs or even his life, Indra can be cursed and disabled that way, and Zeus can have vital bodily parts removed, like his intestines say, and then, well, he won't be fighting much longer after that. Zeus's thunderbolt can take life from a fair distance away, quite quickly I might add, as Asclepius found out. Thor's hammer can dispatch giants, and isn't too bad against gods or other powerful beings either. Thor even wears special gear, both gloves, which allow him to carry Mjolnir, and a belt that doubles his strength, or increases his strength in some way. So it's possible that he's the most physically formidable god here. Indra's lightning has slain enemies that the other gods wouldn't dare to fight, like a stone snake that plagued the people. As far as physical strength goes, I think we can give that to Thor without too many problems. Now, this is followed by Zeus purely for the fact that Jupiter's strength was said to be comparable to Hercules, and Hercules has done some crazy things, arguably the craziest of which being that he was able to hold up the sky in Atlas's stead for a bit. So, yeah, Zeus is probably not a physical slouch by any means. And that just leaves us with Indra, whose 4 arms were said to be, or represent, or to be the sky itself. But I don't actually have that many examples or physical feats for Indra, or feats that I could compare to Indra within his sort of mythology that could give me some sort of baseline there. So we're just going to put Indra last as far as this category is concerned. And then as far as the magical side of things are going, I'm going to give it to Indra purely because of his feat and how destructive his lightning was said to be, followed by Zeus, because Zeus can do some fancy things with that lightning, and there aren't all that many examples of Thor getting all magical on us. So next up we're going to be covering the worshippers, and each Greek god had a temple dedicated to them, and it was 1 god per temple. If someone needed some trait from Zeus like bravery, they could pray to him at home, or they could give him some sort of sacrifice or tribute food at his temple, or almost anywhere in the society for that. Connecting to Zeus, in other words, wasn't exactly rigid or confined to special ceremonies or places, which is quite different to Thor, which Thor would typically see worship like a lot of the other gods at some sort of special place or perceived special place, like a sacred-looking tree or a waterfall. But generally, people tried to stay on the bright side of the gods. Festivals and ceremonies were held by societies to keep a large group of people on the shiny side and make sure that the gods are in their favor. Indra, unlike the previous 2 thunder gods, wasn't or isn't exactly worshipped, because other gods took his spotlight, like Vishnu, say. Because of this, I feel like you'd probably have a more deeper connection with a god like Zeus than you would Thor, purely because of the different ways in which you'd actually be interacting with them on a fairly regular basis. So because of that, I'm going to give this to Zeus, and assume that he has more worshippers, not just, of course, because of the different ways in which you'd actually worship the god, but also his status kind of comes into play here. He is the king of the gods. He is, one of, if not the most important gods in the pantheon, arguably. That's not to say that Thor wasn't important to Germanic people at all, because he, of course, represented this ideal warrior figure, and a lot of his traits gods were very desirable amongst men and warriors and people generally, so Thor would of course have had his status and his importance as well. Overall, Zeus trumps that. And of course, Indra, as we said, doesn't really get prayers, so he automatically by default gets the bottom spot here. Now, moving on to some things that you should generally know, both positive or negative, about each of the gods. Zeus put a pillar between Ares and Hercules whilst not physically being there, so his wrath definitely would be something that you'd have to always be concerned about, being on the wrong side of, as long as you're doing no good. If you're doing exactly what he would expect you to do, or whatever the pantheon of the religion expects you to do, then I suppose being on the bright side of Zeus is probably quite a happy thing, especially because of how connected you'd probably be to the god. But unfortunately, we have to mention one of Zeus's greatest and probably most memed downsides, and that's the fact that he wasn't exactly the least promiscuous god by any means. I could give you several examples, but I'll just use one that shows multiple things about Zeus, and that's the fact that he did the business with his brother's wife, who he helped kidnap. He disguised himself as Hades, so no one ever knew that, this didn't happen, or I guess perhaps Hades would have found out, maybe not, but Zeus got away with it. There was no punishment for Zeus, and for the most part, there were never any punishments for Zeus doing this. At least, none that had any lasting effect on Zeus himself. So that would be something to consider. Zeus could really ruin your life and get away with it, and there's not all that much you can do, not just because you're immortal, but also for the fact that he's Zeus. If there was a child as a result, you probably wouldn't be able to do anything to that child, and the child would probably be better than you and be destined for greater things than you, and, well, I don't know, if you're a jealous person, that could just be an added sucky thing to think about. But then there's also the hypocritical side to Zeus as well, because he bound Ixon to a heated, spiked wheel for all eternity, just because he did the business with Hera's cloud clone at some social event that Zeus or the gods invited Ixon to. So, Zeus got a bit of a temper, and he will punish people for breaking the laws or committing crimes or going against the rules of the society or religion, but he won't hold himself accountable for breaking any such rule broken. There's also the fact that I just want to make clear as well that Zeus has no problem with using trickery or deceit to get what he wants. It's probably found out in the example I gave before, but just wanted to highlight that a little bit. Now, like Zeus, Indra also was a bit of a deviant in that way, but unlike Zeus, he actually got a bit of a comeuppance for it, and, proof of his misdeeds were shown all across his body 1,000 times. In other words, he got 1,000 things all over his body that he really didn't want, and then said that they were eyes, because, in that situation, there wasn't much he could have done anyway. All because he misbehaved with Ahalya, the wife of a saint or sage. Also, when he gets drunk, he tends to boast about being a god and just becomes generally arrogant, so might not exactly necessarily be a fun person to be around, but he is okay with being drunk, so probably more fun than Zeus. I don't know, Zeus seems to be a bit of a grumpy old man type, so, there's that. And lastly, we have Thor. Thor kind of has a random douchebag side to him as well. Like the time he threw a giant overboard near the world serpent just so that he could have a better chance at fighting the serpent because the person he threw overboard was a bit of a coward. And they were only on a fishing trip at that. And before that, he kind of messed with the giant stuff anyway. So yeah, Thor's a bit of a dick. Thor also doesn't give giants much of a chance to explain themselves. If he sees a giant, generally, he'll be the one to smash their heads in or something like that with Mjolnir. So, yeah, he's not very tolerant to some of the other races in Norse mythology. And to a degree, he is the designated god who has to deal with a lot of these other races. There's also something to consider if you're a giant, so. But then there was the time that he just kicked some random dwarf onto a burning pyre that was made for Thor's brother, Balder. And this dwarf really didn't need to be kicked onto the pyre. It was for Balder and his wife, and this random dwarf just burns to death and goes to hell for not really much reason other than the fact that Thor just wanted him on there. Yeah, it was kind of random. Now, without question, Zeus would be the most likely to sleep with anything that sparkled, and was quite strict when it came to anything that either threatened his position as ruler or broke one of his rules. Indra was seemingly less promiscuous than Zeus, but that's admittedly a hard act to beat. Thor might be the one to give you little trouble in that regard, but someone to question because Thor might might be the one to give you the least trouble in that department, but his anger is something to question, because what would he have done if he wasn't given his servants after his goat's leg was hammered into by one of the children? Would he have destroyed the farmer's house? Would he have murdered the farmer? Would he have refused to give them rainfall? And that's another thing all of these gods share. They all have the ability to grant rainfall and are gods of harvest or agriculture in some way like that. Thunder deities also generally seem to share some sort of temper, but I wasn't able to find many examples of Indra striking people down from an outsider perspective that didn't deserve a bolt, so he's going to win this section overall, followed by Thor, because there's still that uncertainty as to what exactly he'd do in his angriest situation to people. And of course Zeus, because we know what Zeus would do to people in his angriest. The worst things imaginable is what Zeus would do to people. And now we have to make a decision, and Thor's the most honest god here. Unlike the other two, he won't disguise himself or use trickery to get what he wants on his own, and he usually takes a direct approach. He only disguised himself as a bride because Loki convinced him that was the best way to get Mjolnir back. His bravery has wavered once or twice, perhaps whilst he was in the presence of Fenrir, assuming that he was in Asgard at that time, because usually the descriptions of that story that I hear are quite vague in terms of which gods were actually there. So, yeah. And also, it seems like something of an inconsistency that Thor would be brave enough to take on the World Serpent, who's definitely larger than Fenrir, but unwilling to stand his ground against Fenrir, who's a smaller beast, and I suppose less ferocious than a giant reptile, but hey, that's just personal opinion. But the point here is that you don't want your god to abandon you when you need their power, right? Zeus was one of the few who didn't when an ultimate fearsome monster knocked at his gates. But Zeus will use his position selfishly to fuel his own ego by keeping everyone and anyone who might present any sort of threat in check, and by taking what he wants, in disguise or outright if it doesn't hurt his position. He fears losing his position above anything else, but I suppose that's his greatest and arguably his only fear, besides maybe the fears that a parent would have. Indra might have the power to cause trouble for his own gains, but he's not above punishment, unlike the other two gods of thunder, and can keep his anger in check as far as I can tell. They all have their pride, but Indra is the one most likely to put it aside to actually help people. He also has the strength to fight and succeed against more threats on the field than Thor can, thanks to his more versatile arsenal of a divine elephant, various weapons and tools, plus a horse. He's also best equipped to deal with more combat scenarios than Zeus or Thor, and is most likely the most forgiving out of the three gods, which means you're least likely to be struck by lightning. With Indra at the helm. I'd pick Indra first for those reasons, followed by Thor, all things considered. But hey, that was my opinion. What's yours? Do you think Indra doesn't deserve the top spot? Am I missing some horrible story in which he was dangerously angry and perhaps that ruins some of my argument here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like them, go ahead and subscribe and give me suggestions as to what gods you'd like me to compare in some way next. And until the next video, have a very good day. I've been Prime and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.